Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Look at all these empty seats. Somebody at the casino? We are making a lot of money in the beef industry, so we probably have some disposable income to go out there and spend at the boat. You won't find me there. I remember when we sold cattle a whole lot less than today, right? I was talking to somebody a little while ago, and I said that I parted with 3 cull cows and a bull on Tuesday, and then 1 little knot-headed steer, and they netted $6,700. And it went straight to the bank. But I don't feel bad about that. If the check is too heavy to carry to the bank, I'll find someone to help me carry it. Really happy to be able to talk to you today. You're going to find that I tend to, as we were mentioning a little while ago, I tend to be kind of a TV evangelist, so the videographer is going to have to keep up with me. We have 3 screens. I may be in front of all of them at some point here. I'm a native of Missouri. I grew up in Cairo. I just moved my family back to Cairo. It was a 20-year circle. Never thought we'd end up there, but that's where we're at. And I don't know if it speaks to my credibility with you at all, but I run cows in Randolph County as well. So I'm very intrigued by this business. I love being a meat scientist. I love working at the University of Missouri. Teaching is my thing. And the research that we do, I think you're going to find that both Dr. Lorenzen and I have a very applied research program that we think solves some industry problems for us. And we've got a lot of cool things going on over at the university right now. And hopefully you have an opportunity to get updated and keep up with what we're doing. But today what we want to do is take the opportunity to talk to you about 3 steers that came to us at the University of Missouri Meat Lab out of the Grassfed program. We had the opportunity to evaluate those animals live. We have some video clips that John so graciously provided to us, and then some still pics. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do in terms of evaluating a live animal for their market readiness. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lorenzen for kind of the middle of this talk, and she's going to visit with us about yield and quality in general, what parameters go into that, how we're trying to determine value, where we might encounter some discounts in this market, and then I will pick it up again with some of the still pics of the actual carcasses from those steers. We'll look at those, we'll talk quality, we'll talk yield, and then we'll show you the carcass data at the very end. And if we keep this train going fast enough, we'll have time for you to start asking us questions as we finish it up. So we'll jump right in here. What is this? A white box. I tell my students in Animal Science 2114, if you know what this is, and then you know what the 3rd slide from now is, you'll probably go a long way to getting an A over the 16 weeks. This is fat. Fat is square. Okay, that's one thing we need to remember. Fat is square. Okay, square fat. Okay, if fat is square, then what is this? Not fat. If it has a white background, it's a Japanese flag. This is muscle. Muscle is round. Okay, fat is square, muscle is round. When you evaluate a live animal for their market readiness, if you can discern the difference between square and round, you're a long way to deciding if that animal is ready to go, depending on what your endpoint is. By its inherent nature, if we think about skeletal muscle, all skeletal muscle has tapered ends and it's fat in the middle or in the belly of the muscle. So we start to stack those kind of fat middle tapered in things on top of each other in skeletal muscle attached to our bone, and we have the buff curved look, right? It's the difference between a bodybuilder and a buffet dweller. Okay? So fat is square and muscle is round. If you look at some of the really old literature, you go clear back in the 20s. I wrote a bit of a review on this one time. We go back in the 20s and somebody says that we get the musculature built on an animal, and then the fat tends to fill in at a point of least resistance. Well, if you stop and think about it, that's right. And we're going to look at on some of these animals and these video clips and these live or these still pics. of where these animals are becoming fat, and it really seems to be the point of least resistance, except in the case of intramuscular fat. Dr. Lorenzen will tell you a little bit about that when we talk about some quality. So these are some really old pictures that I used to use to teach some evaluation, and part of what I did with this was to tell you that we can kind of get to the same value on a carcass in a couple of different ways. Some of it's just simply by selling pounds of beef, right? And if you look at today, the discounts aren't as great because this market really says we need meat, we need beef. And there's not that much out there. We're feeding a lot of really heavy cattle in the conventional feedlot world. I spend a lot of time in packing plants, and it is hard to find a carcass coming out of the feedlot industry under 850 pounds. All right, that speaks volumes to what we're doing. We're having to take a lot of pounds of beef to the marketplace. So we take this old Charolais cross steer. I'm going to argue that this steer has a lot of muscle, based on a little bit about what I know about his genetic background. He does have some fat cover, and we'll talk about where that's at. I want you to keep him in your mind's eye for just a second as we consider this calf. Okay, what are the biggest differences that you immediately see between those two animals? Okay, we got some that are fed harder. This black steer is a deeper bodied creature. He's not quite as tall at the hip, a little smaller in his frame, probably carrying more fat pretty much everywhere. He's square. He is square. I mean, this animal looks like his head's attached directly to his shoulder and they forgot to put his neck on. Okay? I took these two steers out of the Funk feedlot in Illinois back in 2001 and used them as a teaching tool. And then we went ahead and killed them at a local plant and broke them out in a class, and we did a lot of carcass yield. And you can probably imagine how this went. The Charolais cross steer was a yield grade 2. He graded low choice, pretty high dressing type of carcass, and when you put the value to him, at that time, it was a very acceptable value. Well, the interesting thing is, we took this black calf, who for all intents is almost all Angus. We killed him. He's a yield grade 4 something, graded high choice, and dressing or carcass yield was a little bit lower. At the time, though, the interesting thing is that these steers actually carried the same value. Okay, I just said same value, though. What we don't know is anything about what it took to get them there, right? Okay, so that's a tricky point about what we do in this evaluation thing. When I'm presented with a group of cattle, and somebody says, what's the most valuable steer in the pen? Well, I can walk out there and find that steer for you, but I know nothing. I don't know anything about its health status. I don't know its age. I don't know what it was fed, how long it was fed. This dude had plenty of days on feed. Okay, he probably got there quick enough. He's an earlier maturing type of animal. So then we're talking about where am I evaluating that animal and where did I evaluate the 3 steers that we had for this conference? Well, we know that if we think about the point of least resistance and where is fat going to accumulate, and we're looking at places like in the brisket, at the 12th rib. We know that the fat depth at the 12th rib is a great indicator of fat over the entire carcass that animal is going to present to us when we slaughter it. Some of these steers start to get a crest on their neck, not like a bull, but a crest on their neck because of fat. We have them fattening in the pawns or in the tail head. If we get around to have a rear view of these animals, we're going to get fat accumulating in the cod, or in the other fat in the case of the finished heifer. And then if you handle a steer, and this is a good season to handle steers, right? We got show season going on, and we have all kinds of judges that are going to walk up and put their hands on these 4-H and FFA cattle that are coming to them. And they're going to handle these animals right here at this 12th and 13th rib junction, and they're going to see how much finish we have down over that rib. And the difference in not being able to do this with your eyeball and not necessarily handling, that comes a little bit of an art, right? Let's go back here. This calf has some fat, but if we really get to looking at it, not near as much brisket, okay? Getting a little bit of fat here in the crest, not near as much at the tail head. And when I talk about a steer being soggy, what am I talking about? It's kind of feedlot jargon, right? What's a soggy steer?
Put a lot of corn in him.
Well, he's probably had a lot of corn in him. Those of you that finish cattle, you go out there and you look at them, you say, well, they're just not quite done, and then it's not too long, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks, and all of a sudden you're like, yeah, they're starting to look finished. When I talk about soggy steers, I look about where they start to accumulate fat in this rear flank, and they tend to drop it down a little bit, and they kind of get big-middled on us. Okay? That's what I talk about as being soggy. That's a soggy steer. It's the difference between probably 60 days on feed. If he was 60 days ago, I probably would say he's not quite there. He might have been, I don't know. I didn't have my ultrasound eyeball to actually measure fat. So those are the kinds of things that we're talking about in evaluating these animals. Here's the tricky part, and you all already know this. A lot of what we're telling you today you already know, you just forgot. Or maybe you haven't heard it in this particular context. These 4 cattle, some of you may or may not recognize these. Back in 1996, a Drover's Journal put out this class of steers and looked at evaluating them for value. And it speaks to that what I was talking about earlier. You would rank these. They had people try to estimate their carcass parameters based on 2-dimensional flat pictures, which is nearly impossible. And all these different calves showed up in this deal. So we have, this was a red Angus steer that turns out he actually had some pretty good carcass value to him, a lot of days on feed. And when I look at him compared to all the other calves sitting on the screen, he's what I would call the soggiest steer. He's got the most finish. He's got a lot of fat in his brisket. The interesting thing is, again, they figured out value. So you've got him, you've got a calf that's got some Brangus influence. This calf came out of Cactus Feed Yard in Texas. You've got kind of our traditional medium frame baldy steer, may not even be medium frame. And then we've got this a Hereford influenced redneck steer. The 2 steers on the right came out of a Texas feedlot. You can see this one's got a brand on his side. The interesting thing is they all had almost identical value to the marketplace. But some of you would look at that and say, there's no way in heck that I'll take steer number whatever and put him in my freezer and eat steak from that steer. We tend to be snobs, right? We beef consumers, we're snobs. We as beef producers also are some of the most arrogant people that we'll ever meet. What we do is right. Guy down the road, be damned, he doesn't do it right. And we hope he has a train wreck so we get more money for ours, right? I've never understood that, but it's true. We are really arrogant people. I don't know, we'll figure it out someday. So we've got a lot of variation, but we don't know how we got here. And right now, how we got there is pretty important to us when we start talking about margins. Because we're selling feeder cattle for $3 a pound for 4 and sometimes 5 weight cattle in north central Missouri. Well, corn at $3.05 and feeder cattle at $3.05, I don't know when that happened last. Never, right? So feeding margins are a little tricky. If we step out of that particular part of this business and we look at this grass-fed world, probably get a leg up in some of the margins in terms of the inputs, but we'll have an extended days on feed. And I think that's something we're willing to accept to plug into this marketplace. Okay, here's our smaller black calf. You don't have water hemp up there, do you? Gracious. Water hemp's the devil right now in my soybean field. So we got these calves. So let's look at this. We got this. This is our smaller frame black calf. Does he have finish? Yeah, I see some heads nodding. Yeah, he's got finish. Okay. Is it heavy finish? He's got some fat. If we look right here, you see just a little bit of rib there, right? This calf does have fat. I mean, we're filling in over the top here. We're getting a little bit of fat coming into this dock area or in this ponds. I'm thinking sheep. We're getting ready to go show sheep at the state fair. But the animal's got some finish. It's a little bit harder to tell here, although it's good to see stuff this green this time of year where these calves were at. Got this black baldy steer. In my opinion, a lot deeper sided calf. And I think when you get around and have seen him live, calf's got a lot of muscle shape. Okay, he's got some finish, got a lot of muscle shape. Really kind of, in my opinion, a little bigger frame, baldy steer. I don't know what his influence is, but based on the blaze, I'd say there might be some Simmental in his background. I could be wrong, and John, you tell me if I'm wrong. But I think what we're going to see happen here is a little bigger frame, a little big, more muscle shape to this calf. He does have some fat cover, but not a lot. And I think if our video wasn't lagging on us, we'd see when we get him out on the move, he's got enough fat. And I think we're going to see that in the carcass pictures. He's got enough fat. This is the contrast if you got that smaller frame steer, and just to give you the look at that, we've got that really pretty big hipped black calf. And what I notice most about this is we can still see hook. When this bigger calf gets out on the move, you can see a little bit of pin, and probably not near the fat cover that we may see in our, or at least I would guess. I do know what they look like, but I would guess that we may have some differences here in total fat cover on this carcass. This smaller calf, he's also what I would call, I've used that term, soggy. We see he's getting a little big middled here, and he's kind of looking like it's time for him to get on the truck and go to town. Okay? So those are some things I want you to keep in your mind. And when we get to the carcass pictures, we have pulled out these still pics and we've set them in right next to the carcass so you'll remember. Okay? But for ease here, we've got the small black steer, we've got the large black steer, and we've got the black baldy. Okay, I think we can all keep track of 3 things, right? Okay, I know it's right after lunch, but we'll keep track of the 3 things here as we go.
Dr. Wiegand talked about things that are different, like frame size, and I'm going to talk about the great equalizer carcass things, like this. Getting to stand on the stage is an equalizer for me. Finally, I'm taller than Dr. Wiegand. He's like a foot taller than me. All right, so we're going to talk about the federal grades of beef. How many of you guys, when you slaughter your cattle, get grade sheets back? I'm really not seeing that many hands going. How many of you guys understand the data? Okay, a couple of you. Well, okay, so we, both Dr. Wiegand and I, while we have the gift of gab, also have the gift of getting through things very quickly. And I did notice that at the end of this session, you guys do have a break for vendors. So if we don't get your questions answered on this while going through the presentation and in a Q&A session, we will be here and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have regarding this. If you don't understand your own data, we'll be glad to work with you so that you do understand it. So we're talking about the federal grades of beef. Before I even talk about this, when your cattle go to market, they're required to be inspected, right? So we have federal inspection if they're going to cross any state lines. Now, there are some things going on with state inspection. There are some experimental programs that I'm sure some of you know about right now that we are experimenting with using some state inspection where they can cross state lines. In some states, if you have state inspection, that can be used for cattle that are going to that means only going to be consumed within the state. Not every state has state inspection. That's mandatory if you're going to be selling your meat. Grading is optional, but most of our meat is graded, and grading in itself serves as a way that we can communicate about meat. And so it means that in San Francisco, if we say it's a yield grade 3 choice, that means the same thing in New York City, it means the same thing in Miami, and it means the same thing in Columbia, Missouri. So it really serves as a communication tool, especially in our retail and food service industries, and even for you when you are selling at the wholesale level. So now let's talk about what the grades are. So these are really intended to relate the market desirability, and they really segment the carcasses, and they do that by giving us different grades for quality and different grades for cutability. And meat science, well, Dr. Wiegand and I love it. We like to make up our own words. Cutability is one of them. And it's really, we're talking in cutability, this is the yield grades, and we're talking about what's our lean to fat ratio and how much bone do we have and things like that. So what do we have to sell? So we are really looking at the value of the carcass and talking about the different quality characteristics of the lean. So in order to obtain the cutability data, I hope everybody can see this. These pillars are maybe a little dark. Everybody hopefully can see this in the back of the room. Okay. So in order to determine the yield grade, precise cutability measurements were taken. And when this was done, they really did a whole lot of carcass cutout where they really looked at every muscle and they really dissected them and took every fat, muscle, bone, cut out like that. That takes a whole lot of time and money. It has to be done precisely to a cutting sheet, which means there's no variation. We can't have, a flat iron here, or a boneless ribeye here and a bone-in ribeye here, or roast versus a steak. That doesn't work. And so all that was done, and then we developed prediction equations, and that's what yield grades are based off of. It's not realistic to do that on every animal. So yield grade equations were developed based on very precise cutting standards. The palatability data that we came up with USDA quality grades, and when I say we, I mean meat science in general, because this was actually done before Dr. Wiegand and I was born, even before I was born, because I'm a little older than Dr. Wiegand. So that was really done. The only way we can do that, we are trying to predict the palatability of cooked meat and do it with the raw product. So as a lot of my friends and I say, that's why I'm always going to have a job, because we're trying to predict the cooked eating experience. So again, if we didn't have some kind of prediction of that, we couldn't really give an evaluation of the product if we didn't have a prediction available, if that makes any sense. We had to do that. So we did that with sensory panels, and then we did that with mechanical evaluations of tenderness, such as Werner Bratzel's shear force. If you've heard of that measurement, that's a mechanical measurement. So we'll talk about quality grade first. That's probably the one you're most familiar with. How many of you guys are familiar with the quality grades? Okay, so the current quality grades we have for young animals, those are probably the ones you're most familiar with, are prime, choice, select, and standard. So they predict the expected palatability or eating experience of the carcass. But this is going to be hard for me. Now, part of the reason I'm also not walking is I happen to have a bad back at the moment. So if you look at this slide, the blue hand portion of the grade is predicting a good eating experience. And the purple portion of the grade is predicting a bad eating experience. So, these grades, so, one thing to note is that you can have good and bad eating experiences in all of these grades. And these grades are set up to be hierarchical. That means one grade is actually better than the other. So prime is actually better than standard, okay? But you can have a bad eating experience even with prime beef. But the other thing to note, more importantly, is you can have excellent eating experience even with standard, okay? Now, what I always like to point out, because I teach in a classroom across from chefs, is the chef across the classroom, he can make that to a good eating experience. I can't. So if you're a really well-trained chef, you can make standard have a good eating experience. So you are, however, more likely to have a good eating experience with a higher quality grade. So basically the USDA quality grade is going to be based on three things. The maturity that's determined by the lean and skeletal maturity of the carcass, the Markley score, or the intramuscular fat, the fat that's within the muscle, and then the lean firmness. As I mentioned, the young grades are prime, choice, select, and standard. Does anybody remember when good was one of the grades? I remember when good was a grade and changed right after I got out of college. The older animals, do you guys know how old they are when they become the old animals? It's after bee maturity, right? They're going to be commercial, utility, cut, or canner. So, and the maturity is going to be based on three things. So the problem is, when we look at carcasses in the cooler, they don't come with a birth certificate. They don't come with any way of knowing how old they are. So we have to look at them based on some physiological ways of looking at the maturity. So we look at the degree of skeletal ossification. And for us, a lot of times that means we're looking at the replacement of the cartilage with bone. And a lot of times that sort of looks like little red flecks get placed into the cartilage. We look at the color and shape of the bones, mostly the ribs. As animals get older, those rib bones start to flatten out and they get whiter in color. And we look at the color and texture of the lean. As animals get older, that texture gets coarser and the lean gets darker. So we're specifically looking at the bones between the 9th and 12th rib. Then we look at the sacral vertebrae and we look for those the ribs to make sure to see if they have gotten flat and if they've gotten whiter in color. When we look at the sacral vertebrae, those are the vertebrae, if you look at the carcass, that they start to turn at an angle. They're the first vertebrae that are the first vertebrae that are actually going to start to fuse as the carcass starts to ossify. So that's the first place you're going to see some ossification. Then when we look at the chine bones on that cartilage, that's where we're going to start to see some of the deposit of the bone into the cartilage, and we'll start to see some redness. Sometimes it actually looks like strawberries are being sit right on top of that chine bone there. And then again, we look at the ribs. These are the approximate ages that go with the maturity groups. So we start to see those cattle being called hard bones or old cattle at about 42 months of age. We do know with our shipping to the Asian countries, we want to keep cattle under 30 months of age. This is just an example of the colors and the texture to meet the maturity. We want to focus on immaturity cattle. We want it to be light red in color and we want to have fine texture. This is an example on the bottom here to the left as you're facing the slide of immaturity, and this would be the bottom approaching probably about dematurity on the right hand portion of the slide. The main factor, aside from the maturity, that really goes into quality grading is the marbling. So this is the deposit of intramuscular fat, and they're evaluated at the 12th rib. They're when at the time of grading. That's anywhere between 24 and 48 hours post-mortem. Most of the time it's done in industry now at 48 hours. We found we get a better grade. And these are the scores we're looking at in order, starting with the highest amount from abundant all the way down to practically devoid. And this is what they look at like. So this is what the marbling cards look like. This is slight. It has very little marbling in it. There are a few flecks. This is moderately abundant right here. It has a lot of marbling in it. What the grader is looking for is you want to see not just an abundance of this fat, you want to see it finely distributed. So you don't want to see a big glob of fat in the middle, you want to see it distributed throughout the ribeye, and you want to see it not coarse marbling, but fine marbling throughout. While we're here, since you guys have grass-fed beef, where does most of your cattle fall in these marbling scores? Do you know? Yep. John's, or I know you guys are slightly small because I've looked at your cattle before. Probably most of yours are right in here, right? Just slightly small. Okay. I'm going to show you a slide to show you where most of the cattle are in the U.S. And this is about right where they are. So if you haven't ever looked at a grading chart, this is what the grading chart looks like. So let me just walk you through it if you're ever going to use it. So across the top we have the maturity. So each one of these represents those different maturity classes. So this is A, B, C, D, E. This is that starting at 9 months. Now the reason it starts at 9 months is younger than that it would be considered veal. Okay, so it starts at 9 months, goes to 30 months approximately, 30 to 42 for B. Down the side here we have the marbling score, and that goes from abundant to practically devoid, and then we have the grades. And the way you would work this is you would look at the maturity, you'd find where it is, you would balance the bone and the lean maturity, and you would come up, say you came up with A50. So you're right in the middle of here, you could draw a line. You could look at the marbling score, say you had small 50. You draw another line across, you'd see where those two lines intersected, and that's how you determine your quality grade. And in the example I just gave you, it would be in the lower third of choice. Okay? Today in the industry, a lot of the industry is using instrument grading cameras to do this, and they still do have a grader, USDA grader in place to confirm what the camera's seen or grade independently. Now, why is marbling important? This figure is called the window of acceptability, and this figure has been out there for a long time. This is really the figure that led to the change in the name from good to select, and led to, so for those of you that remember that name change from good to select, you may also remember that good was never seen in the grocery store at that time. We only saw choice or higher in the grocery store. We also only had an inch of, or we could have up to an inch of fat trim at that time in a bone-in product, but we only saw choice or higher in the grocery store. So let me just walk through this for you. On the bottom of this chart, we have the percent fat, and this is in 2 servings of meat. Over on the left-hand side, we have the overall palatability rating based on a trained panel, and that was on an 8-point scale. So anything above a 4 is going to be considered high palatability, acceptable palatability. And then over on the right-hand side is the actual fat grams. So in the black squares, we have the overall palatability rating of strip loin. And then in the open squares, we have the fat grams. Now, these are actually for each of the marbling scores. So this first one is, so we go practically devoid, traces, slight, small, modest, moderate, slightly abundant, moderately abundant. Okay? So you can see where the overall palatability line here started to flatten out. So we have slight, small, modest, and then moderate is just right here on the outside of the square. So the square was drawn, and it shows that anything from select through choice is considered acceptable by the general population. And so this is why we changed the name of the grade to choice from good to select, and we started to see that as an option. This went along with the warm fat and things of that nature, but before that it was believed that consumers did not want to see that lean of meat in the grocery store and thought it would taste bad. This is the current quality grade distribution we see in the United States. So on the far left in the blue we have prime, the purple is choice, the light blue is select, and the green is standard and lower, and discounts are applied to standard and lower. You can see the bulk of the cattle are choice, followed by select, and this is from the 2011 National Beef Quality Audit. These numbers tend to be skewed based on the price of corn at the time when this data is collected. Now let's talk about the yield grade. So you guys probably hear about quality grade a little more. I think yield grade maybe is talked about a little more in retail and food service settings. So the yield grade is going to predict the percent of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts from the round loin ribbon chuck. How many of you have had a meat science class? How many of you had to memorize that definition? How many of you say it with whatever accent your meat science professor taught it to you? Mine was from Oklahoma State, so I always say it a little funny. Okay. So there are basically 5 grades, and honestly for students this is probably the most difficult concept. So when I say the highest yielding, I mean a yield grade 1, because that's the highest percentage. That's 52% of the boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts. That's the lowest number. So there are 5 yield grades 1 through 5. So the highest yielding is yield grade 1, and the lowest yielding is yield grade 5. Now, just think about this, and I know I should always throw a slide here that really walks through this math, because this math is a little confusing. Right, John? I think you called me on this the first time this happened. So, you start out with the steer. What's the dressing percentage of the steer? 63, 64, 62 and a half, depends on how fat it is, right? But it's somewhere in that ballpark. Now, that's with the bone in. Now you go down to boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, and we're somewhere in here. So you've already lost, let's say so you've already lost what, 37%? You got to the carcass, and now we're gonna lose another, what are we gonna say here, another 50% down here. And so it does get confusing. So you really do start to lose some weight here, okay? I know I'm not gonna train you guys to be graders here, so let's just talk about the factors and really talk about how they affect it. The biggest factor that affects the yield grade is the fatness of the carcass. And you guys that are raising grass-fed cattle know that this is where you guys have the advantage. Okay? Fat is really what is the negative impact on yield grade. So the first thing we want to talk about is adjusted fat thickness. This is also taken at the 12/13 rib interface. You go 3/4 of the way up the rib eye and you take that measurement. You can see by that green arrow there on a yield grade 4. It is you start there at a yield grade 1 and you go to a yield grade 5, and it's obvious that fatness has a big impact. The next is a measure of muscling. That's the ribeye area. Then we want to add the kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. That is hard to get sometimes now, right? Because industry standard a lot of times is to remove that on the harvesting floor. And then the easiest number to get, the hot carcass weight. Okay, so I'm going to go through, there are probably 3 or 4 different ways to calculate or learn to calculate a yield grade. This is the way I prefer. So, and I'm just going to go through it just so you can see the reasoning for how the yield grade is built. So we start with the preliminary yield grade. So the preliminary yield grade starts out at 2.0 even if you have 0 fat. Okay, so it starts out with 2.0, and then you're going to add 0.25 for every 1/10 of an inch of subcutaneous fat. Okay, so that means that the only way that you can have a carcass that is less than a yield grade 2 is if it's superior in some other carcass characteristic, whether that's muscle weight or carcass weight or kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. So it can't just be superior in fatness. It's got to be superior in some other way, okay? Because no matter what, you're going to add for the fatness. Then we're going to talk about heart carcass weight. The base is 600 pounds. For every 25 pounds, you're going to add or subtract 1/10 of a yield grade. If it weighs more than 600 pounds, you're going to add. If it weighs less, you're going to subtract. Now, I, in my head, relate this to fatness. Because if it has more fat, it's going to weigh more, and there's going to be less yield. There's more I have to cut off and throw away, less I can sell, so less yield. So if it weighs more, I'm going farther away from a 1, more towards a 5. If it weighs less, I have less I'm going to cut off, more towards a 1. Okay? Ribeye area. My base is 11 square inches. For every 1 inch, I'm going to add or subtract 1/3 of a yield grade. In this case, if I have less than 11 square inches, I'm going to add. If I have more than 11 square inches, I'm going to subtract. This is a measure of muscling, okay? So this is good. If I have more muscle, I have more meat to sell, I'm going to be closer to a 1, so I'm going to subtract. That's in my mind how I remember it. If I have more muscle, I'm going to subtract. Kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, the base is 3.5%. How many of you guys have ever seen 3.5% kidney, pelvic, and heart fat? Our joke on the National Beef Quality Audit is you can call them all from the van, right? So like 2.5, it's like a 2. Anyway, 3.5%. For every 1% deviation, you add or subtract 0.2. This is another one. If I have less fat, I'm closer to a 1, less I have to throw away, more I can sell. So I'm going to subtract. Every time I have more, I'm going to add. So I think of it as, can I get closer to a 1? Do I have more to sell with all of these factors? And that's how I remember if I'm going to add or subtract from the base. If I look at the yield grade distribution, and I know with the yield grades, it's, that concept's maybe a little harder to grasp than the quality grade concept, and that's why I said that Brian and I would be glad to answer your questions. I'm sure we're going to have time at the end of this, if you have any questions for us individually. So this is the yield grade distribution that was shown in the National Beef Quality Audit here. You can see that in this case there was 15, almost 16% yield grade 1, 41% 2s, 33.8% 3s, and then 8.5% 4s, and just under 1% 5s, and those discounts tend to be at the 4s and 5s, and the bulk of those cattle are yield grade 2s and 3s. These percentages really haven't changed since these have been being done for the last 20 years. And now I'm going to switch it back over to Brian.
I always like to sit and listen to that. It does my heart good. You got 16 weeks of meat science in 20 minutes. KPH. I want to make a comment about that. When I'm standing in a cooler and you've got kidney pelvic, it's kidney knob. Those of you that have judged meats, you know what we're talking about if you stood in a cooler, kidney knob. And to teach somebody that has a zero background how to estimate kidney knob percentage. First thing, that is a percentage of the carcass weight. Okay, that's one thing that we usually forget. It's a percentage of the carcass weight. But what I tell students on the MU's meat judging team, I said, stand in there now. Imagine a loaf of bread. A loaf of bread weighs 7 pounds of kidney fat. Seems bizarre and kind of abstract, right? A loaf of bread is about 7 pounds of kidney fat. You would be surprised how well it works to take somebody with zero background, let them walk into a cooler and see how many loaves of bread are hanging inside that carcass in volume. And they can look at that, and it's different on the sides of the carcass, right? Depending on how we split that carcass, one side's always going to have, because of where the rumen sets and fat accumulates. But you look at both sides, technically you look at both sides. Almost everybody just looks at one side and grades it, right? But you can imagine, I've got this many loaves of bread in there, it's about this many pounds. If I know the carcass weight, or I've estimated the carcass weight, I can actually calculate you a percentage. It's a lot of trouble to do that if you're doing it at line speed. So we get pretty good at saying, as Dr. Lorenzen said, everything's somewhere essentially between 1.5 and 2.5, and 1.5 are bulls. 2 and 2.5 is just about everything else except a really hard finished, typically heifer carcass. So we've got a pretty narrow window, and we're talking about changes in yield grade of 0.1. Okay, minus 0.1, minus 0.2. So in the big scheme, KPH doesn't affect or swing that yield grade quite that much. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. If you ever find yourself standing in a cooler at the blocker, staring at that carcass saying how much KPH is there, think about loaves of bread.
Oh, sorry. Or cans of pop.
Or cans of pop. She's from north because it's pop. All right, and then there's somewhere it's soda pop, and then it's soda. Never mind. And when I went to get a master's in Auburn, Alabama, and everything was a Coke. Sprite was a Coke. Dr. Pepper was a Coke. A Coke was a Coke. Pepsi was Coke. Don't tell Pepsi that. That makes them mad. All right, let's look at some pictures and talk a little bit about these beasts that we have hanging or had hanging. And actually, they're all cut up and in vacuum bags and on a pallet, ready to go somewhere. John will take care of that for us. I did want to make a comment about, John mentioned where we met down at Southwest Center. And something that was very telling that night. We had a large crowd, and we did that palatability or acceptability test. And what we learned is a lot of those really fine-tuned palates could not discern the difference between grass-finished choice and corn-finished choice, or grass-finished select and corn-finished select. And Dr. Lorenzen and I just had this conversation before we drove over here. What's a really important conversation to have is when we get to comparing within quality, the ability of our consumer to discern differences between finishing systems gets a little gray. Now, you can use that to your advantage or your disadvantage, however you want to think about it. But the fact is, for the most part, we get these cattle to a quality endpoint, and the palatability, they'll stand up. The palatability will stand up. Now, if you have something that's choice and really tough, we can get that from all things. She showed you prime and some poor eating experiences. A lot of that's tied back to the tenderness. We can spend a whole nother 16-week class in 20 minutes telling you about that. So what I'm going to share with you here, these are the carcass tags. So I use those to keep my pictures in order here. And at the end of these, we have a full data table that'll show you all these three steer carcasses compared to one another. But this is the large frame black steer. It shows you there that the hot weight on that side was 340. I'll tell you what it is in collectively here in a minute. But the large frame black steer is the one standing behind, obviously. And this is the dorsal profile picture of that steer carcass. So that's the right side of the carcass. If you just walk up to the common person and say, tell me about that beef carcass, what would they say? Would they say it's fat? It's got some fat cover, doesn't it? In fact, I was a little surprised at how much it appears to have. But it's a pretty thin coat, we're going to find. What about the color of the fat? A little bit yellow. We expect that, right? Grass-fed cattle are going to have yellower fat. That's just the fact. And Guernsey steers on grass-fed will look like a canary. Anybody finish Guernseys ever? They got yellow fat anyway, right? I'm sorry, Jerseys. Well, either one, actually, yeah. So we got a slightly yellow fat here. We got a little bit of fat cover, but the truth is, if you were standing in my cooler, unless you can tell that the slightly yellow fat, a lot of you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between this steer carcass and any other steer carcass. Okay? Keep that in mind for a second. So here's our side profile of that particular carcass. Still, I think this looks, if I pull up a textbook and say, show me a beef carcass, looks like a beef carcass, right? One of the things that we'll note, and we're going to come back here in a second, we can still see some purple here. Okay, so we don't have a lot of cover over the round. But when we really want to get down to the cutability or the yield aspect of that, where we need to look is the 12th and 13th rib. And we find that that steer had some fat, but not very much. Okay, not very much. So we're talking about, so this is the spine side. We're going to come around here 3/4 the distance, and we're going to make a measurement. And the folks that work for us in the meat lab did a really good job taking the hide off this beast, because we don't have fat pulls here where we got crazy and in a hurry. So we get a really nice true measure. Okay, so keep in your mind, or if you got a pencil, write down how much fat you think that might be. We'll play a little game. Okay, so write down how much fat you think that might be. So we're coming 3/4 the distance. We're going to measure that fat depth right there. Some other things that we want to look at. If this was a Holstein steer carcass, how would you expect the shape of the ribeye to differ from what you see? Holsteins have the old typical hook in them. Dairy type carcass is one of the most discernible things you'll ever find in a packing plant rail. This is what I would call a very normal ribeye shape. We start to get some deviations from this, and let's take things like some Piedmontese cattle. I don't know if anybody raises Peds. I was out in Denver back in January and got on a rail of Peds, and holy mackerel were they big. And the muscle depth was interesting. The ribeyes were almost round. Okay? So we do see some variation there, but if I'm standing in the cooler and when we rib these, I would say that this is a very normal ribeye shape. Okay? And you're going to guess here on the fat in just a little bit. Now the one detriment to taking photos on these is that we don't have the perfect control of the lighting. So we're going to get some glare and some pushback on this. But what we find is that this is the select or the slight zero card that you saw that Dr. Lorenzen showed. She made a comment about finely textured marbling and then the distribution of the marbling. You see some weird things happen in beef. Every now and then you'll crack one and you'll see that the ribeye may be very well marbled in part, like 2/3 of that ribeye, and then that longissimus gets almost devoid of marbling. Well, you're going to have to, as a grader, you'll have to discount or pull that marbling score down. It may look good in one spot, but it needs to be in the whole face. The other thing that she talked about was that fine textured. The important aspect here is that like this piece of marbling, that counts as one fleck of marbling. Okay, so that's something that as you do some grading or you look at beef on the rail, you need to keep in mind that this is one fleck, that's one fleck, that's one fleck. And actually, as you get out in here, we got some glare from the flash here. But there are some other flecks out in here, but I've got the slight here, and that's hedging a little bit, okay, telling you that we're somewhere going to be in the slight marbling score on this particular animal. All right, so we'll keep that in mind. Let's look at the baldy steer. The side weight on that was 332. Again, I'll give you the collective here in a minute. Remember, this is our baldy steer. Make the comment. I talked about him being, I think, deeper sided. He's a little bigger frame compared to the last one we're going to look at. Here is his dorsal profile, and again, you look at that calf and looks like a pretty good fat cover. The thing that I indicated to you when I looked at him live is that the muscle shape is very good in this calf. Muscle shape is good, muscle volume is good. Got a lot of bulge about this round. When you see it in person at a nice rib shape here, we've got some bulge to the loin, we've got some fat cover. And maybe it's my bias here, but I don't think that the fat color is quite as yellow as the first one. But I think they're both very acceptable. And the reason I'm bringing that up is we're going to see something real different here in just a second. And it'll speak to, I'm sure, diet of those particular animals. So that's dorsal view of that particular steer carcass. Here's side view. And the thing that I noticed the most here is we see a lot more red or purple, however you want to look at it, about this round. Baldy steer didn't have as much fat cover over the round, which, let's just be real truthful, we don't really need a lot of fat cover over the round because we're going to trim it off anyway. Okay, that's as we get into things, we talk about high yielding lean cuts, those big muscles in the round are going to go contribute to that. So this would be trim fat anyway, so we're pretty close trimmed down here. The other thing that I note is we get see a little bit of musculature here as we get into the chuck, down into this arm, and then just in general, not quite as much fat cover overall. And let's compare or look at fat cover here. Okay, just so you know, I'm the same distance. The camera is the same distance from the ribeye when I take these pictures. So, fatter or leaner than the first? Leaner. Okay, now you'll have to write down what number you think this one is. Okay, estimate what you think this one is. What other things do you notice about this particular ribeye? There is more fat in the muscle. Okay, we have a higher marbling score. I lead you there a little bit by giving you the small 0 card. The marbling, did I hear somebody say it's a little coarser? I think I may have heard that. We have a couple of places here that are a little bit coarser, but maybe not too bad. But we do have more marbling flex out here, and the distributions is improved over the first one. Does anybody note anything else? Shape, I heard that. This is a little deeper. Longissimus muscle, when I say deeper, I'm talking about here to here. Indicating we might have more ribeye area. Okay, so we're talking about a higher yield component. What else? Okay, keep that in your mind. Let's back up. Aha, color. Color. This, and even with flash glare, we have some fading right here. Okay, we have some fading. That can be driven by a number of things. Some of it is some chronic or some acute antemortem stress. So personality in these cattle can be an issue. Conditions, body temp, rate of chilling. But this ribeye is a brighter cherry red, and from a consumer standpoint is going to be more acceptable if your consumer is going to walk up to the case and select that. Let's look at how this shakes out. So the preliminary yield grade that comes from that fat measurement, so we're at a 2.7, a 2.5, and a 2.3. Okay? In terms of yield, if you're talking about getting some sort of an added price in this case, we're going to get a little bit if they pull through as yield grade 2s. 0.25, 0.2, 0.15. Where does that compare to average feedlot finished steers? About half. About half. And part of that's by design, right? Because fat depth is an endpoint that a lot of us will use when finishing cattle. So 0.45 to 0.5 is usually a stopping point for us. Okay, so we're talking about cattle in this case, or carcasses in this case, that are about half or less. So very lean animals. Very much in the window of acceptability in terms of ribeye size. I'm not going to lie to you, and this is just probably my bias coming through, but this baldy steer right here, I kind of like that carcass. We got a 12.9i, which is good in terms of when we talk about portion sizing, because we sell ribeyes and steaks on weight, not on thickness. So if we have a really small ribeye, we have to cut it really thick to get our weight. If we have a really large ribeye, if we're going to sell a 16-ounce ribeye, we got to cut it really thin, and that messes with our ability to cook it. So if we talk about windows of acceptability for ribeye size, we come in here, this 12.9, I like that. Called them all at 2.5 on KPH, which I would have guessed they would have been just a little bit lower than that, but when we went and did the math, we actually pulled the fat, measured it, rounded it to the nearest tenth. They all fall in the same for kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. They final yield grade. So here's the function of ribeye area per 100 pounds of carcass weight. So we end up with final yield grades of 2.4, 2.1, and 2.1. Okay, so we're going to get added dollars in a grid if we're going to sell these on a yield and grade basis. Where we come in, the differences are the big frame steer, he's in the lower end of slight for marbling, which puts him at a select minus quality. The baldy steer gets in there on the low end of small, so he's a choice minus. And then we've got the smaller frame calf at a slight 70, which gets him in the upper end of select. So if you consider the window of acceptability that Dr. Lorenzen mentioned to you, all of these carcasses for quality fall in there. We've got carcass weights that are acceptable if you take the industry in general, albeit these are probably on the light end of what we're doing now in the feedlot world. But if depending on where you're selling, I have some consumers that buy some freezer beef from me. They don't want an 850-pound carcass because, quite frankly, they can't even afford to buy the quarter of beef from me. Okay? So those are the carcass data. Yeah, we're going to let John speak to the production system real quick, and then we'll take some questions.
The small steer actually spent the winter down around Mobile Bay on cereal rye and cereal ryegrass and came up to Missouri in May. So it was on a really high profile grass program all the winter. The two bigger steers there spent in fact, the large black, Wayne Rasmussen took care of him last summer. And the black baldy came out of Missouri, were wintered on male sterile forage sorghum, so they were kind of off the grass program from Thanksgiving until we had grass this spring. So that may explain the small black.
I'll try to make this quick. I've spent the last 12 years of my career working on the fat profile of animals. Started at Iowa State working with CLAs, and those of you in this business know that conjugated linoleic acids are higher in forage and grass finished cattle. We have an incredible link between CLAs and health in a diet where we're eating in moderation. Some people you can't help, okay? They can't, whatever. So I think a good marketing point, we know in general that the CLAs are higher in these animals. The thing about CLA though is if you feed CLA to some other non-ruminant, i.e. humans, dogs, pigs, the degree of saturated fat in our profile is going to increase. That makes your cardiologist want to go jump in a river. Okay? The trick to this is though, 18O stearic acid is a neutral, fully saturated fat in terms of our health, in terms of our cholesterol numbers. So when we start to see the degree of saturation increasing in this kind of profile, a lot of times we're in the 18O area, and that you can push back on your cardiologist all day long. Tell them to call me. Yes, we do have another fatty acid, 16O, that's kind of the bastard in this deal. But if we're going to eat in moderation, I think that the health benefits in some of these fat profiles far outweigh the losses it will take. And especially, so if it is moderation, I think we're good. The literature is 10 miles deep in the benefits to some of these fats in our diet, especially animal derived. And you can paint with whichever stroke you want. But our doctor tells us to take animal fat out of our diet, and they've been telling us to do this for the last 50 years. And we have seen no decrease in cancer, diabetes, all the heart disease. In fact, if you look in certain populations that still have heavy animal-derived fat in their diet, or that is a higher percentage, they tend to be some of the healthiest people on the globe. So there is a middle ground. I tell people if you're going to give something up, you can give other things up in your diet, but don't give up your beef fat. Don't give up some of your other animal dry, especially your dairy fat.